The story I want to tell you today begins with something almost trivially small. A king sees a vineyard near his palace. He wants it for a kitchen garden. The man it belongs to refuses to sell. And then things become very dark very quickly. The story of Ahab and Naboth's vineyard occupies a single chapter, the 21st, of the first book of Kings. And in its compressed, merciless precision, it is one of the most complete psychological portraits of power and its pathology in all of ancient literature. We read it today with Heinz Kohut, the psychoanalyst who, more than almost anyone else in the 20th century, helped us understand what happens to the person whose sense of self depends entirely on never being thwarted. Ahab is king of Israel. He is not, by the standards of the ancient world, a notably monstrous king. The text gives him a mixed review. Idolatrous, certainly. Influenced by his wife Jezebel, prone to the compromises of political convenience, but not extraordinary in his cruelty. And then Naboth refuses him. Naboth the Jezreelite has a vineyard adjacent to Ahab's palace. Ahab comes to him with what he presents as a reasonable proposal. Give me your vineyard so I can have a kitchen garden near the palace. I'll give you a better vineyard in exchange, or the money if you'd rather. It is framed as an ordinary transaction between parties of obviously unequal power, dressed in the language of fairness. Naboth says, "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers." This is not simple stubbornness. In the Israelite understanding of land and covenant, Naboth's vineyard is not simply his property in the modern sense, it is his family's ancestral portion, the piece of the promised land allotted to his line, held in trust across generations. To sell it would be to sever the connection between his family and their portion of the covenant. He is not being difficult, he is upholding something he understands as sacred obligation. Ahab goes home sullen and resentful. He lies down on his bed and turns his face to the wall and will not eat. Heinz Kohut spent his career treating patients whose presenting symptoms were not the classical Freudian neurosis, anxiety, repression, conflict between desire and prohibition, but something more diffuse and harder to name, a pervasive sense of emptiness, rage that seems disproportionate to its triggers, a need for admiration and affirmation so persistent and so fragile that any failure of recognition could produce devastating collapse, a fragility of the self. Kohut called this the narcissistic personality structure, and he was careful to distinguish narcissism in this clinical sense from simple vanity or selfishness. The narcissistic personality, as Kohut understood it, is not a person who loves themselves too much. It is a person whose self is insufficiently formed, whose internal sense of identity and worth was never adequately consolidated, usually because the developmental environment of early childhood did not provide what Kohut called sufficient mirroring, the consistent, attuned reflection back from caregivers that tells the child, "You are real, you are valued, and you exist." Without adequate mirroring, the self remains fragile. It depends on continuous external affirmation to maintain its coherence. And when that affirmation is withheld, when the expected admiration is not forthcoming, when the request is refused, when the world does not reflect back the image that self requires, the fragile self responds not with ordinary disappointment, but with what Kohut called narcissistic rage. Narcissistic rage is not the ordinary anger of frustrated desire. It is something qualitatively different. The rage of a self that experiences refusal as annihilation. The king who cannot have the vineyard does not simply want the vineyard, he needs the vineyard in some deeper sense that neither he nor Naboth fully understands, in order to remain the person he believes himself to be. Ahab on his bed, face to the wall, refusing to eat. Kohut would recognize this immediately. This is not peak, this is collapse. The king has been refused by a subject, and the refusal has produced something close to dissolution. He cannot metabolize a no. The structure of his self does not have the resilience for it. In this scene comes Jezebel. She finds her husband prostrate and asks what is wrong. He tells her about the vineyard and Naboth's refusal, and she says, "Is this how you act as king over Israel? Get up and eat. Don't worry about it. I'll get you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite." Kohut would observe, Jezebel does not treat Ahab's distress as something to be examined or questioned. She treats it as a demand to be satisfied. She does not say, "You are the king, you can survive a refusal, you do not need every vineyard you want." She says, "I will get you the vineyard," and she does, by having Naboth falsely accused of blasphemy and treason, stoned to death, and his property seized by the crown. Jezebel is what Kohut would call an enabling figure. She stabilizes Ahab's fragile self, not by helping him develop the internal resources he lacks, but by removing the obstacles that reveal the lack. She does not heal him, she protects him from the experiences that would require healing. And in doing so, she makes possible something terrible. Naboth is killed. Ahab gets the vineyard. He goes to take possession of it, and Elijah is there. In the place where dogs licked up Naboth's blood, dogs will lick up your blood. Yes, yours. Elijah's confrontation with Ahab is not primarily about the vineyard. It is about what the desire for the vineyard revealed, about the king who could not tolerate a refusal, and the system that arranged a murder so he would not have to. The vineyard is the occasion. What is on trial is the structure of a power that cannot be limited. Ahab's response to Elijah's arrival is striking. "So you have found me, my enemy." Not denial, not outrage at the accusation, recognition. He knows Elijah. He knows what Elijah represents. He has, at some level, always known that what he did was wrong. And the first thing he says when the prophet appears is, "You found me." The narcissistic self that has enacted its rage and got what it wanted still knows at some level that the getting was wrong. The vineyard that requires Naboth's death is not the vineyard that would satisfy the need. Nothing satisfies the need. The need is not for vineyards. What Ahab needed, what Kohut would say he had always needed, was not the vineyard and not the palace and not the kingdom. He needed a self that could survive a refusal, a sense of his own worth that did not depend on the continuous expansion of his domain, the capacity to hear Naboth say no and remain intact. This is what was never given to him, or not given sufficiently. The text doesn't tell us about Ahab's childhood. It tells us only about the king he became, a man of real power and real fragility, whose wife could mobilize that power in the service of that fragility with devastating results. Kohut was not naive about moral responsibility. He understood that the narcissistic personality structure is an explanation, not an excuse. Ahab is not exonerated by his fragility. Naboth is dead. The dogs lick his blood in Jezreel. But Kohut would ask us to see, alongside the moral judgment, the psychological reality. The king on the bed with his face to the wall is not simply wicked. He is broken. And broken people, given power, break others.